Welcome to the Villanova University Centre for Irish Studies podcast. My name is Joseph Lennon, and I am the Emily C. Riley Director of the Centre and host of this podcast series. Villanova's connections to Ireland extend back to its founding and continue to this day. We offer a major and a minor in Irish Studies and have 6 study abroad programs to Ireland. We teach in 8 disciplines and host distinguished visitors to campus. This podcast aims to share some of our conversations and expand the bounds of our community beyond campus. Thank you, and feel free to share. We're here today with Stephen Sexton, and Stephen teaches at Queen's University Belfast at the Seamus Heaney Centre. He's an award-winning poet of 3 books. The first, Oils, came out in 2014 and won the Poetry Book Society Winter Pamphlet Award. He's the If All the World and Love Were Young was published in 2019, and Cheryl's Destinies was published in 2021. We're very fortunate to have him at Villanova this semester as our 2025 Heimbold Chair, named in honor of Charles Heimbold, whose memory we honor with this chair. Stephen, welcome. How has your time been at Villanova so far?
Thanks, Joseph. My time has been really splendid. I've been here for mostly a month, I suppose, a little break in the middle to take some Villanova students to Belfast to think about conflict and writing through conflict and all the things involved with that. I've had at least 2 seasons in Villanova, fantastic winter, delightful summer, as far as I'm concerned, but spring, to be technically accurate. It's been really wonderful. I've met your fine and generous colleagues. I've learned a lot about many things, about Irishness in an international context, about how it is understood in this part of the United States at this university. I've learned an awful lot. It's a real pleasure to have visited Villanova, and I look forward to being back soon.
Yeah, well, it's wonderful to have you here. I know that you've spent time with our students, and I wonder if you could just say a couple of words about how you think about poetry as a vehicle for students to navigate the world. And I'm thinking this in particular around If All the World and Love Were Young, which has a video game, Super Mario Brothers theme, and bringing students over to Northern Ireland. They're really introduced to Belfast through poetry. How do you think about poetry as a vehicle for students to see the world?
I mean, I hope that it can be a pretty effective one. I suppose it depends in many ways on the kind of poetry they've been exposed to or have accessed. I mean, like many of us, poetry is something reserved for special, heightened occasions in many ways, that it is a device for weddings and funerals. Of course, we know that it is much, much more than that, and literature students will have a differently sophisticated understanding of poetry. Partly in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, in Ireland in a general sense, I mean, we've long had a very profound relationship with poetry. I mean, there's still that belief that persists in Ireland, as it should, and it does in other places too, that poetry is a real living thing, that you will encounter it in society in Ireland. You know, if you go into some pub or some cafe or some establishment of repute or ill repute, I would bet you could poke someone in the arm and ask them for a poem, and they could give you something. I think it's living in that sense, that it's really present in our society.
Yeah.
It's an island of storytellers, as we like to think of ourselves. But that engagement with language seems so present to me.
So I'm at the begin. So the beginning of the video game era I grew up in. So Pac-Man, Galaga. But I didn't go much deeper than that. And when Mario Brothers came out, that was sort of, I was, a little bit older. Can you tell us about why you chose this as a metaphor?
I can.
As
yes,
a sort of controlling, world.
I can, but the answer might be less satisfying than you want. I mean, this is around 1991, this very particular video game, Super Mario World of 1991. It's something that I spent quite a lot of my childhood with, and I came to really think about it as a place. It is not, and it is a set of pixels organized by a processor. It is not a place. But in the sense that a child is developing imaginative capabilities, that is a really profound thing to spend one's childhood with. That it starts to become a real place. But what I found myself doing with that video game was many years later, starting with the idea of a joke that wouldn't it be silly if someone took the digital landscapes of a video game such as Mario, and tried to interpret those as real pastoral poems, as if they were real places. What worked as mischief for 20 pages or something like that. I work very quickly when I'm being mischievous. It happens with great
Very
haste.
funny too. The poems are not only joyful, they're illuminating.
I think they're joyful. I hope that they're joyful. But at some point in this process, I really had to honestly reckon with myself, what am I doing? Why are you doing this? And that happened because the more I tried to, access again the first experience of this video game as a child, what I had to do was put myself back in the room again where I encountered this, but I couldn't put myself back in that room without populating the household and being able to, remember the world outside. The crucial difference is that my mother had died between me writing these poems and me having played this video game as a child. And so this presence, the question of elegy, crept in to this work. And I had a moment, which is a real moment that I can still kind of summon, where I had to choose, what am I doing here? Are you really doing this? Are you writing what might become a book of poems that's largely a joke? Or are you in fact writing elegy? And I decided to accept that I was writing elegy, much as it was a surprise.
It's incredibly moving. And I think it's, to paraphrase a student who asked a question last night at your reading, the real and the digital real. I play Minecraft a bit with my son, so I understand what you're saying about a digital landscape becoming a real in some sense, in terms of your emotions, in terms of what you connect to. That's not something that I think older generations or previous generations, have encountered to the same degree. So when we're thinking about the real and the unreal, or how emotions come to get layered into these landscapes, do you make a clear divide? I mean, it seems like there's not a clear divide in them, and that it's actually just like another place. But it does raise the questions of the digital world, the real, the outside the digital world, the real world. Is one more of a valid place for emotions?
It's a very good question. I would say that the emotions, the emotional seat, I guess, of this book is trying to make that negotiation exactly. It's trying to work out which is the proper place for these emotions.
It does bring
to take
in the
place.
question of isolation when you're playing. Sometimes I go down and I see my son's playing video games, and I say, you're not playing with anyone. Of course, they may be playing with 30 people. But how does isolation and the emotive, there seems to be a sadness on some level that's appropriate to elegy.
I think there is. I'm reminded of a marvelous phrase that I read when I was writing about this book and trying to contextualize it for myself, and as part of a PhD project by a critic called Peter Buse, and he talks about children playing video games and using the joystick. He has a marvelous phrase where he says that this completes the circuit of specularity. In other words, the child sees himself or herself seeing an iteration of himself or herself on the screen and gains control of them, but also gains a sense of an external experience, and I suppose cause and effect and all these things. So that while there is a kind of isolation, there's also a developing sense of a relationship between the physical and the real, that while the real body is stationary, a kind of sprite is active. It is everywhere. It goes places that the real body
that's
can't.
the proper term, I believe. It's sprite.
I think it's the proper term, isn't it?
But the students reacted very positively to the book and found it to be. I can't speak for all of them, but it seemed they were very moved by that. After your reading, people did leap to their feet to applaud. So could you give us just one tiny taste of it from that book, and then we can move on to talk about Cheryl's Destinies?
I would love to. What's a good example? Let's see.
And I'm wondering as well. I mean, something like Yoshi's Island, or
It might be the best place to start. Well, there's a good. I think there's maybe. I think a good example maybe is Yoshi's Island #2. I mean, it's one of the first places I think where that absolute binary between a digital world and the real world, they're put into contention with each other. There's this sense of one world existing behind the screen of a television, and another world existing through a pane of glass, the real world. But each of these worlds is mediated by a screen. Each of them, has this crucial distance. But perhaps I'll read this.
That's great.
I'll read this poem. Yoshi's Island 2. Pixels and bits, their perpendicularity. One of the worlds I live in is as shallow as a pane of glass. The threshold of the window sets a frame around the holly tree, wild funguses slimy with dew and toxicity. The rubies of holly berries sing on the branches the robins hide among, and the veins of ivy vines wind around the slumping trunk and boughs, slow berries in the blackthorn and the carcinogenic bracken. Groundsels loiter along the low-dashed wall the daisies loll about. One summer's day I'm summoned home to hear of cells which split and glitch so haphazardly someone is called to intervene with poisons drawn from strange and peregrine trees flourishing in distant kingdoms. We take the air in the garden, bitter with berries and mushrooms too toxic to eat, where the grass bows in an unexpected breeze.
It's such a moving poem.
I was talking to some of the students here at Villanova yesterday, and I was reminded of one part of the process of this poem that surprised me at the time and still surprises me now. I was explaining that in the process of writing this, you get a rough draft of it down, you get a rough idea of what's happening, but then at some point you accept what this book is and what it's trying to be and what its themes are, and then you've got to go back and write through it and correct things in various ways. But I was pointing out to them one of the great bits of fortune that I had is something I learned from the poet Kieran Carson, who's a big believer in going to the dictionary, of knowing what you're talking about, that the language will tell you what to do. You're not...
As you would say.
He would. That you're not really in control of this, the language it wants to speak. But an example I gave those students was the word peregrine, which is a word that is, fairly high register. It shouldn't really be here in some ways, but it's here to mean foreignness and strangeness and rarity and all those sorts of things. But one of the things that I also learned is that Saint Peregrine, or a saint with a name very close to Peregrine anyway, is the patron saint of people who suffer from cancer. And that's what this book is about. But that's the kind of fortune, strangeness that language wanted to give to me. And although I am the author of this book, I spent so much of the writing of it in a kind of fugue, where I was able to access my imagination in ways I'm not usually able to. I had a kind of fluid relationship with language, where I feel so lucky that it came to me.
You lay down in the word hoard.
I lay down there.
Far from Seamus Heaney.
And it came to me. I did not seek it, really. But this is a book that I don't know if I could do this again.
No,
I don't think that's possible.
It's a remarkable, just the resonances of language. I once had a conversation with Kieran Carson. We were talking about playing music, and I played the mouth harp, the harmonica, and I said, "Gosh, I'd love to write a poem about playing the harmonica," because we were playing music, and Kieran said, "Well, what would you write? Why don't you just write that?" And I said, "I don't know. What would I say? Bend all the blows?" And he said, "That's it right there."
It's pretty good.
And so the sense of writing it's interesting to hear your thoughts about Kieran, who passed away
2019,
2019,
October
yeah.
2019.
Yeah.
This book was published in pretty much the end of August 2019. So one of the things that really meant a lot to me was that he did get to see it,
right.
and he meant a lot to me and to many poets of around my age, and many poets of every age, as an influence. And he was there through what I suppose I must call a maturing of my my interests and passions in this. So it really meant a lot that I was able to send this to him. It's not the most cheerful
it
of
must have
subjects.
meant a lot to him as well.
He wrote me a lovely email, and it mattered an awful lot. So he's very missed, but his influence is everywhere.
Yeah, and I don't know, he was sort of a patron saint of many, but also he was the poet of Belfast, for at least for my generation and for others. I wonder if you could read from Cheryl's Destinies a section of the poem dedicated to Kieran Carson. So it is.
I would love to, and interestingly, I had a conversation with Kieran that is at the end of this first section that I'd like to read for you. Wonderful. We were having a conversation about another reed instrument, the accordion.
Oh, lovely!
And I was asked. I just got it. For some reason, I just got an accordion. Kind of in love with the reeds because they're so close to breath.
I bought an accordion once. I had it in the closet for a long time. I took it out.
I was getting pretty good at mine before it went.
Good man.
But I had a piano accordion, and I was trying to ask him about it, and he was very displeased that anyone should be playing the wrong kind of accordion.
You should do the push button.
It should be the button accordion.
Yeah.
That's all. But it was very nice. But yes, I would. So this first section is at a particular moment. We were at a poetry event, and it was great. He stayed all night. He sort of looked at his watch at some point and realized it was 1:30 in the morning. And, left abruptly, but it was a really special kind of evening that I remember a lot. It refers to a poetry event that was run by Stephen Connolly and Manuela Moser called The Lifeboat, which is named after a Michael Longley poem, as a matter of fact. But that's the context that this happens in. So maybe I'll read this first section. So it is. So it is a detail of wind turbines combs the oakish hills and feels gorse-limbed, fallow, or dazzled with eyebright. These craftless rotors transform the invisible into the intangible. The good breeze of breath becomes the lamplight farmers study journals by, the pall of street lights drawing towards the city, the dreadful candle of the crematorium. I know the road's every inch, its urgent camber and final curve at which the country falls away, where, like a diorama of itself, Belfast emerges shining among its accoutrements of history, mystery, industry, river. If the office of Lagender is obsolete, no matter. Unaccounted for bales of linen, plugs of tobacco, barrels of barley and hops remain unaccounted for. Well settled by now, sunk into the strata of centuries of silt, where above the river, old ornithomancer interprets its future from cascades of starlings, big moons, and how many years ago now, ourselves smoking cigarettes on a rickety gangplank after a spell of your verse on the long moored barge. Was that the night Stephen and me skippered the boat as far as the railway bridge after a few beers, coursing at a blistering half a knot an hour, safely chaperoned by its registered keeper, who knew his starboard from his sherry, and took steer and figure-of-eighted us between the columns and puffed the little skiff back to its mothership? Those nights of Brie and Rachel's hospitality, of poems from Wayne and Andy and Leontia, Sophie, Sam, Jack, Sinead in the galley cafe, the barge sweltered like a greenhouse and rocked in storms. Once you accepted Zubrovka, whose long blade of bison grass goes a-quiver with its measures, and our talk turned to tempers of accordions, the proper box and the no, no, no piano, whose big breath and bellows I was enamoured of, whose ranks and banks of reeds, switches, rods and buttons are engineered for the alchemy we're after, to return the unvibrating air vibrating.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, in some ways trying to imitate the very long sentences, the astonishing syntax that he was capable of.
And also the quite the detail of Belfast and its environs.
And particularly, along the Lagan, on that river.
I was thinking that I know the roads every inch is almost the Patrick Kavanagh July evening, right? Inniskeen.
I think it probably is. It must be in there somewhere. Yeah. I've got another echo in my head, but I'm not sure where exactly it's coming from. Could well be some of Kieran's work. I expect it probably is. But what exactly?
But he may be echoing Kavanagh.
He might be echoing Kavanagh.
Who knows? Yeah. It's wonderful. I mean, he was such a mentor and such a beloved poet. And I mean, his place is sort of cemented. I wonder, if we can talk about Cheryl's Destinies for a bit here, the impetus for this book, which moves magisterially between times, between modes, between genres, and thinking about how we navigate, I guess, just how we navigate the world. But could you tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned last night this had to do with it was written in mind of the decade of centenaries in Ireland.
It was, and I think to say it's maybe written is maybe a slight overstatement on my part, but the poems were coming from that period. In many ways, this probably should have been the first book that I published. Many of the poems here, maybe not many, a fair few predate the first book, If All the World and Love Were Young. So I took I'm very luxuriant. I've had two first books is the way that I like to think about it. This being a more proper one. But some of the earliest poems start from around maybe around 2015, 16, 17.
Okay.
And it was a time when I was becoming increasingly aware of the at least two kinds of histories that in Northern Ireland we were experiencing.
And maybe we should pause just for a second to say the decade of centenaries really began in 2013 with the Dublin lockouts.
That's right.
And then continued through the Civil War. So 1913 commemorated in 2013 and up to the Civil War in 22.
But for me, interestingly, because I was inaccurate, I assumed it started in 2012 with the sinking of the Titanic, which of course is not part of this decade of centenaries. But because of the presence of the Titanic and the history of shipbuilding in Belfast, my assumption was that it must have started there. Right. But I was incorrect.
But you were going to say about Northern Ireland.
But I became particularly aware. I mean, that's one example where the Titanic was not part of this official program, as far as I understand, but seemed like an obvious centenary. This is one of the most major things that has happened. But I became mostly aware of it in 2016 when there were many debates on talk shows and things about how exactly or how not we should, people in Northern Ireland, should commemorate, celebrate, memorialise, whatever words we wanted to use, the Easter Rising of 1916 or the Battle of the Somme of 1916, both of which are central in different ways to Unionist and nationalist traditions in Northern Ireland. And my frustration was that it seemed to be, zero sum, that we could not do both, that it must be the other. And were Northern Ireland to acknowledge formally one of these, that will upset the other side. And it was just a real tedious example of that binaryism that we are sometimes forced to live with, where we can't even agree. Well, we can't agree what didn't happen in many ways.
Talking about split perceptions of politics and the nation, I don't know what you're talking about
I'm
here,
sure you've
living
got no
in the
idea.
United States.
And it's interesting, what we do with that, like what happened, what didn't happen. So I was very frustrated that again, history is being contested, but also in the spirit of all good and sort of bad horror movie tropes. 50 years after the event, 100 years after the event, a kind of portal opens. There's an opportunity to revise and reconsider, and public thought is focused in a certain way on these events. And we're asked to think about them again. So I was aware of the sense of moving through these series of anniversaries. And then, of course, what happens by the time we get to 2020, 5 years ago, around this time of the year, we start trying to work out how that pandemic was the same or different from the last pandemic, the Spanish flu, again, approximately 100 years. And I think when that happened, I had a much greater sense of this book cohering around that idea of pasts and futures and presents.
And for our listeners, I think that this sounds, to me as an academic, fascinating. But you're doing something beyond the idea level. You take W.B. Yeats and Billy Corgan from Smashing Pumpkins and put them together in the same poems, and not in a way that is seems gratuitous, but is an incredible synthesis. It's just a remarkable achievement, I think, as someone who loves, much pop music, or at least alternative or other kinds of, music, as well as, lots of music. But to bring that into poetry in a way that is not just referential is just extraordinary to me. The composition of the poems is a matter of subject, or is a matter of discussion with Yeats and his wife George and the automatic writing, but also how Billy Corgan creates and the band creates this by redoing and retaping. I wonder if I could convince you to read a poem of this, and if we could listen for a minute to a take from Today from the Smashing Pumpkins.
I'd love to.
Yeah, and it's great rock and roll. I remember, but it's also an incredible layering of sound that you pick up on, as poetry is, with this layerings of sound. And you have the title of these poems by the length of the tracks that were recorded. Maybe you could read 319 from Today, but I wonder if you could just talk to us about that decision about the titling of these.
Absolutely. I mean, the titling was a necessary legal decision. I mean, I was quoting not too heavily, but quite heavily from the lyrics to some of these tracks, and also the titles. And we, me and my editor, and the wider team, took the decision to limit that as much as possible, because this is copyrighted material. There's all sorts of reasons why we may not do it. But the solution we arrived at was, instead of the title of the song, so in this case the song Today, to represent it by something that perhaps could not be copyrighted, which is an amount of time. And what this section is about is really about art making in times of stress. That's one thing, but it's about, I mean, in the case of Yeats, he just got married. Things were a little bit rocky. He became interested too much in the other world. And so his wife, by way of, I suppose, calming him down, they get into this automatic writing, and she produces these
Maybe
metaphors.
You should say what automatic writing is for a moment.
I mean, I suppose in their context it was, this half seance, half communion with the spirits, that she would enter into a kind of trance, and he would ask her questions, and she would commune with these otherworldly people. I sort of half fancied that one of the people she got in touch with somehow was Billy Corgan. Was this? But I mean, for all the kind of, I think there is quite a lot of silliness in this. But
That's wonderful.
The central idea is how do we make art in times of stress? And I mean, one of the things that was particularly challenging, I think, about the pandemic, which we might remember or might not remember, is this sense that we were trying very hard to describe what this was like. And there were so many clumsy metaphors at the time and similes. People would say, like, this is like being in prison. And of course, it's not like being in prison.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing like being in prison.
Yes.
Or it's like being locked away in an asylum or something like that. But what is much more interesting to me there is what that represents, and what the pandemic took from us was a way of making meaning, especially metaphor. We could not say what this was like. We tried.
Yeah.
We could not find a way to describe what this was like. And one of the reasons I thought for that is an argument that we need each other for metaphor. Like we need society for metaphor. And I think of a lovely phrase by philosopher Ted Cohen, I think, who said that metaphor is the achievement of intimacy. I think the idea being that, a metaphor kind of takes two to tango. It takes me to pose it to you, but it takes the reader to go, okay, yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah. And my feeling was that we didn't have, we lost our ability to make meaningful metaphors because we could not be with each other. We could not share spaces with each other. So in a kind of willful and radical act, I thought, well, if I can't be with my friends and I can't see my family, I'm going to make W.B. Yeats talk to Billy Corgan. I'm going to make people go together who can't be together. I'm going to put them in a room. I'm going to let them talk about art with each other. So a very radical approach, but I think, as you say, and I'm
very sensible as well on some level. It's just imaginative. It's a leap that, I mean, it's the mashup of different characters from different novels or different genres and putting them together
and making them go together
and making them together. Yeah.
And I feel like they're very similar people.
Or pop songs, too. I mean, there's some great... Anyway, give us a bit of it.
Yeah.
Or give us the 319.
319. The great day is a gift Yeats will treasure. So great a glory did the song confer. All hurt and wonder in E-flat major, the sentimentalist of all the keys. The beggars have changed places, but the lash goes on. Yeats is singing sotto voce, the sentimentalist himself, while art is but a vision of reality. Says Billy, he may have banished the band in a rage, but with Yeats's expertise, he's destined to wrap the album growing ever overdue. I'll burn my eyes out before I get out, the majesty that shuts his burning eye. So a blend of, Yeats's verses here and there, mostly in iambic pentameter where I could find them, and sometimes Billy Corgan's going to respond. But where I find myself, and the way that these poems are organized is that, there's sort of three tabbed areas. There's William Butler Yeats, who's tabbed to the left. There's Billy Corgan, who's tabbed to the right. And my voice, the sort of lyrical voice of the author, is in the middle. Or my lyrical voice is the medium, which is what Georgie did. She mediated between these things. And so I am too mediating between different kinds of time. I'm using the poet's voice, I suppose, as medium, someone who interprets signs and tries to say what they mean.
In the previous poem, like everything that has the stain of blood, we must remember beyond his making. The drummer cut takes until his hands bled, to Billy himself mad scientizing with the great wheels of the amplifier, but what a tender brute with the guitar. What is the mad scientizing? Can you?
I mean, part of it is
reading
about this period of recording, which was in Georgia. I think it was a notoriously fraught experience for the group, where at least once they were sent away, and the mad scientist, Mr. Corgan, secretly recorded most of this himself, in this kind of way of responding to stress, but also in quite a lot of innovation in this recording session. I mean, and absurd guitar setups and very noisy, monstrous kind of effects, and it was recorded in the way that things used to be recorded. Tape was cut,
tape and spliced,
and razor blades, and and that is a true anecdote from that time. That kind of dictatorial, I would think that. Yes, the drummer Jimmy Chamberlain, one of the best rock drummers in my mind. It was sort of like, you're doing this again. This isn't right. Repeat it. And there is an anecdote of
being a taskmaster,
of being made to do this until he was bleeding. The sort of fraught experience.
That poem's and so their collaboration begins, each at the elbow of his century, tenors singing in search of their burning vehicles. Is the burning vehicle? I think of vehicle in terms of metaphor, as the what carries us from one meaning to another, but I think of it in those terms. But burning vehicle in Northern Ireland has another resonance altogether.
It does. That is my my tedious literary joke. Is that's one of the senses of it, of trying to work out what this means. What does any of this mean? What is this as a sequence of poems? What does this mean? Obviously, it's a pun on singing, but although it's said that Yeats wasn't the best of singers.
That's what I understand. Yeah, he did. Don't tell him that, though.
No, I don't think he's the sort of man who wants to know that. But it's partly that. There's less of a sense, I think, of that violence in Northern Ireland. It's inescapable in some ways. But what we did have around this time, was quite a lot of violence in the United States. So it's I can't remember exactly when George Floyd was killed, but it was around, I don't remember which month it was, but it was, that was in the atmosphere, and I was aware of this violence breaking out everywhere, and all of the stresses and anxieties of the pandemic, and the act of violence itself, that starts to creep into these verses in some ways. There, though, it's mostly my metaphor.
But it's wonderful. But you sense the moving between the two times, right? In a wonderful way. I just think it's curious, it's innovative, it's bold, and it's successful, right? In how it does it. So I wonder if we could. I was going to ask you also about migration, but you read a poem last night called "Wild Ireland," and I think that sustainability, questions of climate change, questions of rewilding or ecological destruction are behind so much of what poets think about these days, and I see it in the work. But when you wrote specifically about Wild Ireland, there's a movement in Ireland. I don't know how large of a movement, and there's some resistance to it, but to rewild certain areas and to develop more sustainable forestry practices, that sort of thing. So I wonder if you could read that poem and maybe comment a little bit about it, because it seems there's a little ambivalence in it, just about caged animals and what we're doing. But is that?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's specifically a kind of wildlife park, not quite a sanctuary, certainly not a zoo. Just in over the border in Donegal, from where we live in Derry. And I love animals. I love seeing them. And it's a really, I think, gentle and generous and humane place that often for the bigger creatures, such as bears and wolves, they've been rescued from conditions that they should never have been in. So part of it's that. But the main ambition, I think, for the place that's long-term is to reintroduce creatures that were once native to Ireland. So many of them are surprising. I would not have thought of bears as being native to Ireland, but...
Well, if you go to Inishmore, the place is overrun with rabbits because there's no eagles to eat them.
And I think, too, that marvellous poem by Paula Meehan about, all brown bears in the world can be traced to one Irish mother bear. That's genetically true. But it's just, it's a marvellous place, and I love it. But it's also, naturally, I think when borders are involved in Ireland, and we have this delineated place where the wild animals may be, it's hard for me not to think of what kind of border they live behind, and by extension, what are the consequences of dropping these cages? What are the consequences of losing these fences? There are plenty of people who think this is a terrible idea. But it might not be. That's as far, I think, as I'm willing to skirt even myself with the politics of it. But it's kind of inescapable in some ways, because I don't know what I mean by wildness in some ways. I do have an idea of what wildness is, but here it's certainly animals. Is the main thing.
Yeah.
But the star of this poem and the star of Wild Ireland is a lynx called Nisha. And my great surprise was to think of the lynx as native to Ireland.
And Nisha being the from the Ulster cycle.
That's right, yeah. And I think in that context is a boy's name.
Yeah.
Although I guess there are many Nishas who may be many things. Yeah. But I'll happily read this poem about Wild Ireland.
You.
On the border, where mobile networks elbow for sovereignty, the wolves are back. So are the brown bears, boars, and Barbary macaques. And so is Nisha, the lynx, agile as secrecy, singularity of her own simulated forest, who can pluck from mid-flight the blackbird who strays into her enclosure. Some zoologists prefer re-establishment to reintroduction. But that's the dream. One of these days, the tour guide says, to expand her habitat by a few square kilometres, then to do away with the high fences altogether and let her roam. The bears, so mistreated, are out of the question. The wolves, and this was once wolfland, would flourish, but for farmers and their economies, the risk of unintended consequences. Consider Yellowstone and its trophic cascade. Wolves thinned out the elk who wiped out the willow with which the beaver builds dams and ponds where fish multiply, the willow where songbirds nest. Given new riverbanks, rivers changed course. It's not overnight, but what's night for a wolf? What we know of Nisha's nativity is a jawbone, which implies teeth, which recommend tongue. Her true nation, if she has one, is where you think you saw something move, where she's long gone.
It's like the poem Memory by Yeats, that it's the bent grass where the hare has lain.
I think that is probably in there too, and the various versions of that I think have existed in some ways. But it's also true. I think I'm very interested in nationhood and in nativity and who gets to belong to where. And I regret very much that we're going through a moment in Ireland where that is being questioned and tested,
and national boundaries and borders are being built up,
which is
and wildness, of course, sees no boundaries. They see territories of animals, but those are always shifting and overlapping and not the same as humans would demarcate.
Absolutely not. But also, for me, the question of nationality. It's not something that's present in my mind all the time, which is a certain kind of privilege that I don't have to think about it. It doesn't come up. It doesn't. It is
but
not
it's
questioned.
in your language.
It's in the language.
It struck me just some of the word choices that you would have in that poem seem to resonate Northern Irish politics.
I think so. I think that's definitely there. But it also pivots to an example in this country, up in Yellowstone, which is a successful
absolutely.
instance of this that I'm sure was met with considerable resistance at the time.
Yeah, and continues to be
anyways,
by some. Yeah, I wonder if I'm looking at your epigraphs to the book. Who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? The Marx Brothers, and the future is not immune from colonization. I don't know that last quote. Ziauddin Zadar, the futurist.
Futurist, futures theorist, depending on which language they like to use. It was a book I happened to be reading around this time about the various ways that we conceive the future, which is one of the reasons that the sort of mysterious tarot element occurs in this book quite a lot, and this figure of Cheryl, who's directing things, shows up. Because what we do in times of profound stress is we think of the future. Again, I know we're always doing it to some extent, but these booms, in Yeats's case, was following the First World War, when this interest in the future became reestablished. It happened in the 1960s when the Vietnam War was going on, and after Korea, of course. It happened again in the 1990s. There was a boom in, I suppose after the Gulf Wars, this sort of boom in tarot and this kind of esotericism. And we're in one at the moment. I think we're in an occult moment for different reasons, partly war and uncertainty, but I imagine more economic challenges, a lack of uncertainty for young people, the fact they can't find anywhere to live in many cases.
I know in the States, Afrofuturism has made an enormous surge.
Is that right?
In popularity.
Yeah. In recent years?
In recent years, really since George Floyd.
Okay.
And the Black Lives Matter movement. I wonder if you could bring us out on another poem that would, and tell us a little bit about Cheryl and her destinies, and maybe ours.
I will try.
If you can read some tea leaves, and I'll give you a minute to check. But the questions of how we choose or how we create futures, I think, is on people's minds as people are concerned very much so about the present.
They are, and I don't know what I was going to say,
Yeah.
but they are. I think very profoundly. We're always doing that to some extent. I think we're worried about this considerably. But I like it. I like this slightly occult practice. But the one thing that I absolutely learned from reading the works of writers of future studies is that it's always plural. It always has to be plural. And I think it's important that it's always plural. I mean, we all,
In which sense?
that they would never be. It would never be future studies. It would always be futures studies.
I see.
Because there are always choices. There are always options.
And it's never clear.
It's never clear, and nothing is really inevitable, which I find quite an encouraging idea. So in that spirit, there must be destinies.
The
here.
past may seem inevitable, or the present may seem the inevitable conclusion of the past, but there are many alternate possibilities. Yeah.
Well, I'll read a poem towards the start where Cheryl shows up, and Cheryl is kind of in the same role as Georgie, George Hyde-Lees in some ways, in that she's this figure who is able to interpret in some ways. But this is a poem that I find it quite interesting because it's one that came quite early and is very mysterious to me. It's called My Second Favorite Locked Room Mystery, and it's interesting to me because this is, I suppose, what we would call a kind of dramatic monologue. This is not me who's speaking in this. I've never actually worked in a bowling alley, despite patronizing the bowling alley many times. But I find something quite interesting about this poem in that the poem solves this mystery. It solves this riddle, but the speaker in it doesn't. The speaker doesn't know what the answer to this riddle is, but the poem does, and it felt like an interesting way of thinking about structures and voices and the certain patterns that we exist in and all these things.
And the riddle being?
The riddle being a very, I think, classic locked room mystery that a man has hanged himself from a high rafter, but there's no way that he could have gotten there. How did he get there? And the answer is that he stood on a block of ice, which is subsequently melted. But the person in this poem, despite sort of flirting with the answer on so many occasions, doesn't seem to get it. But yes, this is an introduction to a character called Cheryl, who is mostly that. She is a character among these poems, and she has this gift. She is what the poet does. She looks at the world, she looks at symbols, and she tells you what they mean. I would like to be Cheryl in many ways. My second favorite locked room mystery. Since I started working at the bowling alley, I think about it all the time. In his barn, from a high rafter or crossbeam, a man has hanged himself with no ladder or platform to get him there. Nothing suspicious, save a patch of damp on the straw-strewn dirt floor. Cheryl, on the other hand, is really into tarot. When the soda fountain's not so busy, she shuffles up my destiny, and every time seems to draw the lovers. Think about it. Flashes the braces in her smile, and the pin setters chew like beautiful mouths. Thinking about the future always makes me so thirsty, so while Cheryl sorts out pin jams and inventories the shoes, I slurp a Coke with plenty of chipped ice, and before long my head is full of icemen and their cold chariots, horse-drawn ice plows, the lakes of Massachusetts. When she's fed up with Kismet, Cheryl lets me build little card castles, and I sometimes think I could marry her some hot day in the summer, an ice sculpture of a bowling pin undoing itself into a puddle of water at the highest of June. And I think of his horses. What were their names?
It's such an amazing poem. The whole book is amazing, Stephen. I want to just congratulate you on pulling together a book that bridges time and bridges readerships. I'm so grateful for Wake Forest University Press for bringing it out in the States, and I congratulate you. thanks for being here. Any final words for our listeners?
Not beyond my great gratitude to you, Joseph, for this conversation, for the lovely welcome I've had here, and for thinking about these poems and talking to me about them. It is wonderful to do that.